They thought he was just an old, harmless farmer, but when the cartel broke into his barn, they awakened a beast they never expected. The Marine commander who had led men through wars wasn't done fighting yet. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the rhythmic creak of crickets and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. Somewhere in the deep rural lands of Mississippi, tucked between fields of corn and old wooden fences, stood the weathered barn of Ezekiel Carter, a 68-year-old black farmer who most of the small town thought was just another elderly man trying to keep his land alive. His skin was tough and darkened by years under the sun, his hands calloused from work, and his gait slow but steady. He looked like any other farmer to outsiders, but the truth was hidden beneath that rough exterior. Ezekiel was a retired Marine commander who had spent 25 years leading men in deserts, jungles, and mountains across the world. His past was stitched with scars no one in town knew about, because he rarely spoke of it. To them, he was simply, Old Man Carter, who sold vegetables at the farmer's market and minded his own business. But that night, fate had a different plan. A black SUV rolled slowly down the dirt road, its headlights off, creeping toward Ezekiel's barn. Inside were 5 cartel men, armed, restless, and ruthless. They had been using the countryside for transport routes, moving drugs through quiet towns where nobody asked questions. But one of their recent stashes had been compromised, and they suspected locals had been snooping. They needed a place to store a shipment temporarily, and Ezekiel's barn, sitting isolated with no neighbors close enough to hear trouble, looked like the perfect hideout. To them, he was just a lonely old farmer. They didn't know that the barn wasn't just filled with hay and tools, it also contained Ezekiel's carefully preserved marine gear, hidden in a locked chest, combat knives, maps, and even his old rifle, cleaned every month though he hadn't fired it in years. That night, Ezekiel was sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee when he noticed faint movement down the road. He saw shadows moving with precision, men who weren't from the area. His eyes, still sharp, narrowed. He set the cup down without a sound, his instincts whispering the same thing they had in Iraq when an ambush was near: something's wrong. He quietly slipped back inside, lifted a floorboard where he kept a pistol in a lockbox, and loaded it. He didn't want trouble, but he knew trouble when it came crawling. When the cartel broke the barn lock and forced their way inside, whispering in Spanish about the packages, Ezekiel was already watching from the shadows of the cornfield, his heart steady, his mind clear. The old commander in him stirred awake. He whispered under his breath, "Wrong barn, boys." The cartel men began dragging crates inside, filled with drugs worth millions. Their leader, a scar-faced man named Ramiro, barked orders while the others laughed, smoked, and tossed hay bales aside like the barn belonged to them. Ezekiel remained hidden, studying their movements. His Marine training had taught him patience: never strike until you've read the battlefield. Every creak of the barn, every careless laugh of the intruders, reminded him of the countless missions where lives depended on timing. He crouched low, his old knees protesting but his spirit unshaken. He could have called the sheriff, but Ezekiel knew the local law was no match for cartel firepower. By the time help came, the cartel would have fortified themselves or worse, spread fear across the whole town. No, this was his land, and he would defend it himself. Quietly, he moved back toward the farmhouse, opened his chest, and pulled out his old Marine knife and binoculars. His rifle was still polished, but he didn't load it yet. He wanted to test the intruders first, to send a message. Slipping through the dark like a ghost, he cut the tires of their SUV, ensuring they had no easy escape. Then he returned to his position, waiting for the right moment. Inside the barn, one of the younger cartel members wandered out to urinate near the cornfield. Ezekiel moved like the wind, silent and precise, placing his hand over the man's mouth and dragging him back into the shadows. The young man struggled, but Ezekiel's grip was iron. With his knife pressed against the boy's neck, Ezekiel whispered in Spanish, his accent surprisingly clean, "Tell your men the farmer is watching." Then he released him, pushing him toward the barn. The terrified boy stumbled back inside, shouting about a man in the shadows. The others laughed at first, thinking he was high, but when Ramiro stepped outside and found their tires slashed, his laughter faded. He pulled out his gun, scanning the darkness. "Old farmer, he muttered, spitting. "We'll deal with him." But as Ramiro turned back, a shot rang out, not from Ezekiel's rifle, but a warning shot fired deliberately to ricochet off the barn's weathered metal wall. Everyone froze. Ezekiel's deep voice carried across the field, calm but commanding, you got one chance to leave my land alive. Take it, or stay and find out who you're dealing with." The cartel thought they could intimidate him, but for the first time, fear slipped into their eyes. They had broken into the wrong barn, and the old farmer wasn't backing down. The cartel refused to leave. Ramiro, too proud and too dangerous to show weakness, barked orders for his men to spread out and find the farmer. He underestimated Isaiah's experience. This wasn't just a barn, it was a battlefield now, and Isaiah had already mapped every advantage in his mind. Using the darkness as his ally, Isaiah moved silently through the cornfields, setting traps with wires and tools he kept for farming. A rake here, a tripwire there, small tricks he had learned from jungle warfare. The first man who wandered too far from the barn tripped over a wire and slammed into a wooden post, knocking himself unconscious. Another heard rustling in the stalks and fired blindly, only to be struck by Isaiah's shovel handle to the back of his neck. The barn that had seemed like a safe haven was turning into a cage. Ramiro grew furious. "He's just one man," he shouted. But Isaiah wasn't just one man. He was decades of discipline, strategy, and survival wrapped in a farmer's body. He moved with the precision of a commander, striking from angles they couldn't predict, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. As the night deepened, the cartel began to realize they were up against someone who knew war. One of them muttered nervously, "This isn't no farmer, Jefe, this is military." Isaiah finally revealed himself, stepping into the moonlight, his rifle aimed steady. "Marine Corps," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "And you boys just trespassed on the wrong commander's land." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the sound of one man dropping his weapon in surrender. But Ramiro wasn't ready to give up. He raised his gun and fired, forcing Isaiah to dive behind a fence post. Bullets ripped through the air, splintering wood, but Isaiah's nerves didn't falter. He steadied himself, waited for Ramiro to expose just enough, and then fired a single precise shot that grazed the man's shoulder, making him howl. "That's your warning," Isaiah growled. "The next one ends it." The cartel realized this was no game anymore. The standoff stretched into the early hours of dawn. Ramiro, wounded and desperate, tried to rally his remaining men, but fear had taken root in their hearts. Two had fled into the fields, leaving their leader with only one loyal gunman. Isaiah, still steady as ever, called out again, "This is your last chance. Walk away now, or none of you leave." The loyal gunman hesitated, glancing at Ramiro, then slowly set his weapon down and raised his hands. "I ain't dying for this," he muttered, backing away into the darkness. Ramiro cursed him, clutching his bleeding shoulder, but deep inside he knew the truth, he was outmatched. He had underestimated the man before him, thinking age made him weak. But Ezekiel Carter wasn't weak, he was steel sharpened by years of war, a lion disguised as a farmer. With the rising sun painting the fields gold, Isaiah advanced, his rifle unwavering. Ramiro tried one last desperate move, lunging forward with his pistol, but Isaiah's reflexes were faster. A single shot rang out, dropping the cartel leader to the ground. Silence fell over the farm again, broken only by the birds awakening in the trees. Isaiah stood tall, his chest rising with slow breaths, the commander within him finally settling. He walked to the barn, kicked open the crates, and stared at the poison they had brought into his land. Without hesitation, he doused them in kerosene and lit a match, watching flames consume the drugs. The fire roared, smoke rising high into the sky like a signal, this land was protected. Later that morning, when the sheriff arrived after hearing reports of gunfire, he found only ashes, unconscious intruders tied up near the barn, and Isaiah standing quietly by his porch, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. "You okay, Carter?" the sheriff asked. Isaiah simply nodded. "Just a little trouble in the barn." He didn't explain further, and he didn't need to. Because for Ezekiel Carter, the war never truly ended, it just waited for nights like this, when evil crossed his path. And as long as he lived, no cartel, no criminal, and no threat would ever claim his land. Never underestimate the quiet strength of those who have already fought their battles. Share this story if you believe real heroes never retire, they just wait for the right moment to rise again.